Today, we're talking about trauma-informed practice. And first of all, Francine, just introduce yourself.
Okay, hi, so I'm Francine Watson. I was formerly the Global Head of Health and Wellbeing at Barclays. And now I am sort of doing some more independent consulting and retraining as an executive coach.
And you joined the forum from the early days, I believe?
Yes. Along with the Barclays role.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Cary Cooper. I'm a professor here, professor of organization psychology and health. And about 7 or 8 years ago, a group of HR directors and chief medical officers came to see me and said, we've got to have a vehicle, a place where we can talk about health and well-being at work. We think it's really important. These are very, very senior people. We now have 55 global companies and public sector bodies, big time, doing this work. It's a voluntary organization. It's been going now for nearly 8 years.
Great. So, Francine, just first of all, why particularly did you feel the need to put together this excellent report you've done on trauma informed practice? What was for you? Why did you do it?
Yeah, I guess if we sort of just rewind a little bit, as a national forum, we'll typically sort of approach Cary saying these are particular topics that we want to be talking about, and we've got sort of people, HRDs, you've got OM experts, epidemiologists, etc. And one of the questions was we need to understand a bit more about trauma and how it affects people in the workplace. And we had an expert come and talk to us about that. And so for me personally, it really sort of blew my mind because there are things which I thought were really important might actually risk causing further harm. And when we sort of understood really a bit more about trauma, and it's actually a very sort of natural process that people might undergo, that bringing in an expert in too early might sort of disrupt the natural recovery process. It might get people away from their natural sources of support. Those are really important sort of takeaway messages for us. And we thought actually in the forum, we need to make sure that there's more awareness of the evidence and trying to sort of translate that into a really practical framework for people.
So as a senior HR professional, Francine, this whole area and subject, is it one that you have been aware of for many, many years? Why is it perhaps close to your heart?
It was really interesting as we were talking with some other reviewers, etc., about this. It kind of struck me that sort of trauma awareness in the workplace is probably a little bit where suicide awareness might have been sort of 10 or so years ago. We might have thought of it as quite sort of specialist, a bit too clinical for the workplace. But actually, once we kind of really got underneath the sort of the feet of all the sort of the data and statistics around it, you realize it's a much more prevalent and it's a really important sort of public health issue, not just a sort of a workplace issue, really.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And Cary, I mean, as the forum itself, I guess, and you as well, I'm sure, as a subject, is one that you've read and probably written about as well.
Absolutely. I mean, to be honest with you, post-traumatic stress and stress generally in the workplace is astronomical. 55% of all long-term sickness absence was for stress, anxiety, and depression last year in the UK, HSE figures. So this is a big issue. And the trauma that people, when you talk about trauma, it's not just you see somebody being shot in the workplace or something like that. It could be being bullied. It could be vicarious. You could be seeing somebody lose an arm in a manufacturing facility.
Vicarious means?
Or vicarious means that it's not happening to you, but in front of you. Yeah. And somebody getting ill, somebody being life-threatened. It could be any. And if you look at the WHO report and we have this Francine has done it in our report, 70% of people, according to WHO, have experienced a very traumatic event sometime in their life. And I estimate 30 or 40% today, right now, are experiencing some kind of traumatic event in the workplace, which will have consequences if we don't deal with it. And it'll have productivity consequences, but it'll be broader than that because it affects families as well.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Mm-hmm. Just getting a bit more into the specifics of the report, Francine, and why there was need for the particular report on this particular subject. What would you say to that? Why particularly, in terms of trauma-informed practice in the workplace?
So I think basically there's a growing awareness of trauma, but not that much awareness around like what's the actual sort of proportionate response for it. And what we've gone and done is done some research around what do organizations do that are routinely exposed to trauma. And they actually focus a lot on things like prevention, training, the role of the manager. But then we also looked at sort of trauma-informed care and in sort of settings like people that are sort of recovering from addiction, or they're kind of in medical sort of settings, etc. And what we're finding there is that it's much more around the kind of the cultural response in preventing further harm and in supporting recovery. So those two elements are really key in sort of informing that guidance for us.
Something strikes me is, has the need, perhaps become greater in recent years for managers to be much more aware of this subject? I'm thinking perhaps particularly during and post lockdown, since the last 6 years or so. Was that something that sort of you sort of, part of your research, you found as well?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more sort of awareness and conversation about trauma more broadly in society. And I think things like recent kind of conflict, displacement, even things like climate change, racial injustice, etc. That's all kind of brought a lot more awareness around trauma and some of those kind of conversations. But I think there's still a lot of confusion around really what counts as trauma, and how do you effectively support somebody impacted by trauma. And there's, I think, kind of concern about potentially sort of overstepping into sort of more of a therapeutic response and not kind of really knowing and understanding sort of the boundary management of that.
Don't you think, though, Francine, that the individual who's affected by the trauma, I think organizations now, because they look at stress management and that kind of stuff anyway, so they're likely to focus in on that person, but they don't understand necessarily the consequences for the work colleagues of that person, particularly if they've had, somebody's got very badly injured in the workplace, or somebody else has died. They don't necessarily think about the broader group of workers who might also be affected. So I think that's quite important to do that. And I still think there's a bit of a stigma in some occupations that where you're likely to get trauma, whether it's the military, the police, or the emergency services generally. And they're good at helping the individual, but they don't know what the consequences on the broader group is likely to be. And I think Francine's report highlights these kinds of issues.
I was about to say that's, I guess, one of the key elements of the report, isn't it? That talks about that, doesn't it? The wider impact of one person's trauma that it can affect others as well.
Yeah, and I think it's really what we're trying to argue as well is around sort of trying to approach this from a much more sort of systemic lens rather than looking at one specific part of the organization to be involved in the response.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned the response. I mean, I think before we come on to just talk briefly about the specific measures that companies can do or managers can do, go back a second. Is trauma properly recognised by managers as part of workplace life, do you think? I mean, you mentioned there's some sectors where inevitably, people experience trauma, NHS, paramedics, military, whatever, you know what I mean? But I mean, is there a sense in which in other sectors, is it recognised at all? Or?
I think when you say trauma, you might think of like a specific, or trauma in the workplace, you might think of a specific event or specific kind of professions that might be impacted by trauma. But when you look at the more clinical definitions of trauma, it gets really interesting because we're looking at things like, I'm just going to read here. So exposure to actual threat and death, serious injury, sexual violence, events of an extremely threatening or horrific nature. And that also includes direct experience witnessing those events, learning of them occurring to others, or repeated exposure to those details. So if you think about that particular definition of trauma, then we can start to think about what might be those specific events. And we're talking about things like witnessing death or serious injury, unexpected death of a loved one, a robbery, a life-threatening car accident, or even sort of serious injury. So that's just part of the fabric of life. It's not confined to just a specific event. It's not just confined to a specific profession.
And what sort of positive steps can managers take to perhaps start addressing the issue in greater depth if they're not addressing it perhaps as much as it should be?
I think for me, it's just around aspects like kind of being approachable and listening and asking what the individual needs from a support perspective. And again, like the emphasis is not on the trauma itself or trying to get any sort of form of disclosure, but the individual themselves can be supported to understand what they need to enable their recovery through work. And it's really important as well. One of the things that kind of really stood out for me is the importance of work in the actual recovery process itself. And so I think that's quite an important aspect.
Touch on your point, Cary, about perhaps giving it time.
The person has to process it. Yeah. A person who's gone through a traumatic event, whether they've been bullied at work or saw somebody die at work or get very badly injured or whatever, they need time to process that themselves. But they also need somebody, i.e. their line manager or somebody, to actually just keep a note of how they're doing and ensure that they're around for them if they need that help. And I think that's kind of critical to do that. They need some space. And then they'll realize this is affecting them. They're not sleeping well at night. They're getting more angry with their kids and not tolerating, this, that, and the other, or they're more socially withdrawn. Some stress manifestation that illustrates that this traumatic event has affected them and they might need some support. But somebody's got to monitor that and be with them. Rather than just automatically saying, we're going to hand you over to a counselor, go ahead. And that's the end of our relationship with this.
Yeah. Just to sort of summing up some broader thoughts, I mean, who is this report, would you say, aimed at? Who would be the person you want to aim it at most? Is it a line manager who maybe just hasn't quite, grasped these issues and this depth? Or, who are you trying to sort of, what is the forum who's it trying to appeal to here?
I think primarily sort of our target audience are HRDs, heads of health and wellbeing, occupational health professionals. Because one of the things we're also trying to, we've talked a lot about the manager, but there's also really important to think about the organization and system as a whole and how that response might affect the individual. So how supportive that environment and culture is can really impact whether there's going to be sort of further harm or whether the recovery can be supported or not. And I think one of the kind of key things to take a look at is really where might you have processes that might inadvertently be causing sort of more harm? Are you requiring people to sort of disclose something in order to benefit from the support of the organization? And I guess one of the kind of key principles or one of the key impacts of trauma is a sense of disempowerment and a sort of a breaking of trust. So anything in your processes that might be sort of like inadvertently sort of deepening that might be something to look at.
Yeah, sure. And the report is full of recommendations, ideas about how companies can respond and how this cultural issue as well across the whole organization. And what's next? Once reports come out, and what do you plan to do more research on this subject? You yourself, or have you thought more about what next step is with this on the back of this report, which is an excellent report? I think we all agree on that.
Thank you. I think I would really like there to just be more awareness of the prevalence of trauma in the workplace, and I'd really welcome organizations to take a look at some of those tools that we've got in the report. So, for example, we've talked a lot about the different types of trauma. We've got a trauma typology that organizations can take a look at and think about where might we be impacted in different parts of our sort of workforce population. The other things we've got are like kind of really practical tools like self-assessment tools you might want to have a look at, a maturity model, implementation pathways. We've got a little sort of employee life cycle audit of where you might be impacted by trauma. But probably my favorite part of the report is actually the case studies, because that's really what brings everything to life in a much more practical way. Yeah. So again, I'd love to sort of see more examples of good practice and what organizations have done, and maybe sort of this kind of thing, sort of taking a little bit more an evidence-based approach, sort of organizations sharing what they do.
And I think, Cary, I mean, what's interesting here is how this links in with other reports that the forum has put together. I'm thinking there's a report this year on metrics in the workplace. Again, there's a link there, isn't there? I mean, another, the report just produced on the rights disconnect and the impact that can have.
Yeah, and the case studies are fantastic, though, Jim.
Yeah.
And all our reports, we have the various companies. We have 55 organizations. I think it's even higher than that now. And that we can draw on their expertise and how they've dealt with this kind of topic, whatever the topic is. So, to be honest with you, that it's a wonderful report. It's very comprehensive, great case studies in it, and will help organizations deal with this issue so we can try to prevent and destigmatize trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very fitting note on which to end. But well, thank you, Francine, for coming up to Manchester today. To join
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
This podcast, and to Cary.
Thank you very much, Jim.
And I urge everyone to look at the report. Well, there'll be a link to it off the podcast. We'll have a web link to the report. Thank you.